William, I wanted us to touch on this issue of crowd solving, because you brought in crowdsourcing as one of the examples, and one would assume that if you just look at the developmental challenges that we still have as a country, as a continent, there could be some crowd-solving platforms built on top of open innovation that could help us accelerate forward in terms of hitting some of those targets. What are your views on this?
Yeah, it's a very necessary thing at this point in time, because as we have said, to be able to effectively do open innovation, you just can't rely on the number of people you employ today. We talked about ecosystem and co-creation, and our viewpoint is that we should get to a point where, as a country, that any person who has any idea on how or we can solve the biggest challenges that we are facing should have a platform to express their viewpoint, and should find somebody who can allow them the opportunity to express that viewpoint. We argue that the solutions to the most complex or big challenges that we have today in Africa must come from Africa and are not going to come necessarily from the rural areas. And our point around innovation is that it's not necessarily going to come from the PhD graduates or from the engineers. It's going to come from the people who are best prepared. I think, as Rapalan said, when you have a dire need, or sometimes when you find yourself in a very sticky situation, you want to use a mobile device, but you have no power. Then people innovate around how they can create small cells that can, power their cellular phones and be able to generate enough power to charge the whole community's mobile devices. We have seen all of those innovations happening in the continent. We've seen people who have got no source of energy innovating around how they can bring innovative ideas around safety in terms of what they can burn to produce or to make food. So innovation is happening today. What we are still lacking is the ability to harness that crowd-solving capability, because our platforms aren't robust, aren't integrated, and are not as available to everyone as they should be available.
How do we change that? How do we ensure that there's great accessibility and money that is available to ensure that these platforms can be built?
Well, a couple of things. I think, firstly, the large corporations are beginning to do it, but they're not doing it in a big enough scale to make this count. For example, I have seen a couple of organizations, let's just pick the city of Tshwane, which is something I'm closer to, have said, we are looking for someone who can solve a problem in this particular area, and we are prepared to pay X amount if you came with the idea and we can implement it. The more and more we see people doing that, right? Crowdsourcing, solving specific challenges at the local level, the more people are going to get encouraged to do that. Some people do it for the money, but some people do it for the fact that they are entrepreneurial in nature, and their ideas don't find expression, and therefore these become platforms upon which they can express themselves. So we want to see more and more corporations doing that. We want to see more and more collaboration with the academic institutions, for example, where if I have an idea, whether I'm a student of that institution or not, I should be able to find a way of accessing the institution to help me access labs and access libraries and access the internet and many other things. So I think that the institutions of higher learning have got a role to play. I think government have got a role to play. We know that we've got the Innovation Hub and many other innovation agencies. What we need to do is integrate all of those agencies together in a seamless way that we know which one plays in which part of the value chain. Right now, people are stepping on top of each other, and there are big gaps in certain parts, and therefore the system, it doesn't augur well for what we could be producing around the whole subject of innovation.
Yes, Rapalang, let me get your comment in there.
I think what he's saying is really, really important, because I think when we look at the education or learning space in particular, we didn't have that opportunity where I think they opened it up to people in the country to say what are the better ideas to do this. And instead, I think a lot of the government or other sort of learning projects are really not using the best technologies that we are available in the country. I think we must always appreciate that there's different degrees of innovation, and people might be thinking further ahead than you, so invite the conversation and open it up. And you may well find much better solutions than what you would have implemented if it's a closed sort of tendering process.
Would you then say that we have a greater chance at hitting the nail on the head when it comes to public service delivery if a culture of open innovation, especially at a municipal level, then just became the normal order of doing business?
100%, especially where there's municipalities where, to begin with, they're not entirely sure what they need, except that there is such a problem. Yeah. So when you try and specify in an RFP or RFI, this is what we want, when you haven't really appreciated the scope of solutions, you've limited the possibility of an ideal outcome off the bat. So it's an ideal opportunity there where there's very limited expertise to invite it in and open up that discussion.
So before I go to my studio audience, Valai and Brian, let's have a very authentic conversation. I think to this end, everything has been very positive around the potential and capability of open innovation. What are the practical challenges that players in the ecosystem are having to grapple with and having to deal with to make open innovation work? And let's start off with you, Brian.
I think I'd like to highlight some of the hidden structural impediments. So if we go back a few years, the fact that the telephony budget was in one part of the organization and the IT budget in a different part, you never got convergence between those because the budgets were held separately. Then we put those together and we got IT convergence. Now the mobile part is held here and the fixed part is here. So we didn't get convergence there. So what I'm saying is now going forwards with innovation, for so long as the budget for school books is held in a different place to the budget for IT, you're not going to drive innovation. So we need to look at those hidden impediments in all of our organizations and in government as to what is stopping innovation.
So it's hidden structural impediments as a key highlight for you. Valai?
I think there are two or three key elements that I would like to bring up. The first one is the perception of what, especially when you look at innovation in Africa, the perception that innovation is really at the bottom of the pyramid, which is something that happens, but the real innovation that is transforming Africa is not happening at the bottom of the pyramid. It happens, like William was alluding to, at the middle level where you really have the skill and the capability to actually bring up move the concept from the idea to a concept to a business line. So I think that's very, very important. The second thing, which is I think an issue, a constraint in that ecosystem, is a skill set.
Right.
Okay. There is a technology skill set that is required to be able to actually be very productive in the ecosystem. But beyond the technology skill set, which is pretty limited for the time being, there is also a business mindset that needs to be inserted into the ecosystem.
Right.
That is something that I think needs to come out more and more. Last but not the least is the business model. We still haven't found in most of the markets a very credible, sustainable business model for open innovation. It's still in the making. There's still a lot going on. I think some players like Barclays are doing a key role into building that business model to make it sustainable, but it's not there yet.